This is a very happy moment for me because one of my most admired teachers has visited us with his wife. It's a beneficence, really. He's actually returned to small-town America. We call it Willits. It was the subject of de Tocqueville, and by reference of Dr. Wolin, as the archaic basis for democracy. And it's my wish and hope that a renewed insight through these small towns will bring wholesome health to America. Now, to our speaker, Sheldon Wolin is incomparably qualified to speak on his subject tonight. He is a scholar and a thinker, and in him, that is not an oxymoron. He is master of his vocation, first among equals in his guild, having contributed language, imagination, and insight into political philosophy across 2 generations, influencing the most political thinkers the most profoundly, and I am one of those. He has educated and exhorted students by thousands to use their education to be full citizens, to apply their understanding as whole human beings. And like Hobbes, he has lived a long life, and his contributions to knowledge cannot be ignored any longer. All of which begs the question, who and what is a political theorist? I reply, the political theorist differs in no way from the shaman, the pathfinder, the wise man, the elder, and the seer. They are all concerned with mankind and how to best live. From the beginning of the race, we have had the same need for universal understanding of the almost inexpressibly powerful aspirations for justice, for community, and for harmony, so as to survive and to thrive and to be one with the natural balance and order. The political is simply the manifested aspect of that great mountain of human wisdom. By the same token, universal understanding is necessary to detect folly and corruption and despotism and avoid their destructive effects. We have a case in point today. The current political model, the utilitarian concept of man which conditions for obedience, subordination, direct and indirect control, mindless repetition, and especially mindless self-sacrifice. All primarily conducive to a given elite's selfish purposes. The expansive concept of who and what the human is, which I understand as implicit in Dr. Wolin's work, leads inevitably to a concept of the political wherein lasting societies and governments harbor and protect the individual soul as a microcosm of creation, a glory of nature, a special gift embedded in its mystery. And this brings us to the devotion of the political theorist. Why is he so devoted to his own society and increasingly to humanity, with the sense that we are all one seed and one flower that blossoms and withers as one? To use the Greek root for theory, theoria, it means to behold from a distance. Many have become enthralled with their own visions and constructions after viewing society from a distance. Few return with the wisdom, but our guest is a constant citizen, as well as a universal mind. The work will go into posterity, but the citizen is with us. Sheldon Wolin.
Thank you very much, Bill. The title of my talk is based in part on the article which some of you have read in The Nation magazine called Inverted Totalitarianism. And Bill has suggested to me in our correspondence that I try to sort of show how I got to that kind of notion and also to some of its implications for right now. Let me first talk about the notion itself by suggesting what I'm sure some of you are at least familiar with, and that is general features of totalitarianism. That is, what are we looking for when we talk about totalitarianism? And let me schematize some of those features. First of all, and thinking basically about the example of Nazi Germany, but it applies to other totalitarian regimes as well, there's a dichotomy at the outset between elite and mass. The elite are regarded as, in some respects, specially endowed, such that their talents and skills make them natural leaders. The mass, in turn, indistinguishable from each other, largely the same, responsive to leadership and willing to follow, and mostly put on this earth to follow. Secondly, totalitarianism also is characterized by a one-party system in which one party dominates the political process and in the course of it eliminates or reduces to nullity the other parties. Thirdly, there's a strong ideology to totalitarian systems. That is a belief system that is coherent, that is palatable to large numbers, and that represents sort of the worldview, the sort of political substitute for religion in such a system. Next, regimes of this sort are characterized by control of mass communications. This is very closely related to the important role of propaganda within such regimes. That is the attempt to, in fact, not only spread the party line, but make the party line the most preeminent of party lines. Now, next, there's the use of terror by such regimes. Now, it's important to remember, as I tried to point out in the Nation piece, that the Nazis didn't set about torturing and killing everybody. The important point was to instill a certain amount of fear, generalized fear, in a population, but not so deep-rooted or so deep-seated as to paralyze the population. In other words, it was to sort of be a vague presence, punctuated now and then by the fact that people would hear about cases of in which people were tortured, or who were put in concentration camps, or were generally disappeared, as we say these days. Next, totalitarian regimes, particularly of the Nazi type, are expansionist. They tend not to remain contained within the boundaries of their system, but rather there's a certain dynamism that takes them outwards. But that's accompanied by treaty violations and a general tendency, particularly marked in the case of Germany, to launch wars on the flimsiest of pretexts, to invade a Poland, claiming Poland's going to attack Germany, invading Czechoslovakia because you claim that a German population in Czechoslovakia is being badly treated, and on and on. The Dutch are a threat, the Danes are a threat, the Scandinavians are a threat. So that the pretext on which foreign wars are fought are ones in which the regime takes the initiative and which, by most rational accounts, there's very little basis for their claims about it. Now, this is closely related to another matter, and that is totalitarian regimes are characterized by the subordination of domestic policy to foreign policy. Foreign policy and its demands financially, its demands in terms of manpower, Its demands in terms of resources have the first precedence. And domestic policy tends to be put on the back burner, tends to be relegated to the point where it mostly takes the form of trying to prevent widespread discontent and or rebellious or mutinous feelings among the populace. Finally, they are societies in which military virtues are exalted, in which heroism, manliness, willingness to die, willingness to sacrifice are not just virtues, they're preeminent virtues, exalted virtues. Now, turning from then this sort of general sketch, let me now try briefly to say what I mean by inversion, by the inverted totalitarianism. What I mean by that is this, that a political system can approach or even imitate a totalitarian system without not only seeming not to be a totalitarian regime, but even professing to be the opposite of a totalitarian regime. Now, that's not an easy point to make, but it's going to be crucial, because if we take, for example, the question of elections, under the Nazis, elections were mostly staged, that is, managed, controlled, and in which the choices were very few, in fact, non-existent. So that elections really became plebiscites. That is, they became yes or no's, with the no's not even counted. In other words, elections could be manipulated, were manipulated, and consequently the regime nonetheless could claim that they had popular support. Now, the question that makes this inverted, or if we put the question this way, can we say that we might get the same result in a political system, that is, where you get elections which are controlled or staged, and not necessarily, as in the Nazi plebiscites, 96 or 98% voting in favor of the regime, but a substantial portion of them, so that the outcome is one in which the system seems to be very difficult to alter, very difficult to change, even though there are apparently free elections. Now, we can take that one step further. We can say that while under the Nazis, propaganda was strictly under the state control, there were no independent newspapers or radio stations at the time. But then, as we know, it's possible for the media to become increasingly more consolidated, increasingly more homogeneous, increasingly more uniform, and that the net result is that it becomes very difficult to enter counter opinions or to encourage dissident points of view. Now, to take another example, it brings us, I think, even a little bit closer. Most scholars agree that the Nazi war machine really had no other purpose except to wage war. That is, the regime itself became increasingly empty in terms of any kind of goals or purposes or values other than war making. Now, this introduces a really significant point, I think, in terms, if we think about the war on terrorism. Immediately after the September 11th disaster, the president said we could expect to have 20 or 30 years or more of a war on terrorism. In other words, it seemed to be endless. It seemed to be a kind of war at which, unlike other wars where you enter into it thinking only of the point when you can have peace and return to normalcy, and where the end of the war is something that everybody is in favor of. But with the idea of a war against terrorism and the nature of terrorism, a kind of form of power which has no state, which has none of the ordinary accoutrements of government, which is shadowy and which appears to be never in the same place twice, yet appears to be all over. You have, of course, in a certain sense, a recipe for unending war, for war which goes on and becomes, by that fact, a conditioning factor of your society. It becomes as much a part of your environment, so that when, for example, you take what used to be a simple thing like a ride on a plane, becomes now tinged and edged by military paraphernalia around, by soldiers, by guards, by all kinds of equipment, all the other things we know. But what I'm trying to get at is simply the way in which war becomes an ingredient, a lasting ingredient of a culture, and in the process changes the cultures. Now, another interesting aspect of this is that while the Nazis, for their part, mobilized the entire economy, put it on a wartime footing, as we were saying, and put the population on a wartime footing, and thereby reduced unemployment. Inverted totalitarianism more or less lets the economy go into free fall, and despite rising unemployment, refuses to take any really significant measures. In other words, there's a certain element which an economy that produces, in many ways, an element of fear continuously, the kind of fear that comes, for example, not only from depression, but also from loss of jobs, downsizing, a rapidly changing market which makes old skills, former skills outdated and anachronistic, so that the society again becomes something in which you don't want to cure unemployment. You don't want really to have full prosperity, because that takes away an edge from the society that's produced by the prevalence of fear, even if it's often unexpressed, even if it's often sublimated and repressed. Now, if we ask, as I think Bill was trying to ask me, when did I start thinking in this, what might seem to some as an extreme way? Well, I think my starting point was that I don't believe the things I am talking about as inverted totalitarianism began with the Bush administration. It didn't begin yesterday or the day before. Now, that's by way of preface to something that occurred to me when we, if you can take your memory back a bit, when our society and the rest of the world entered the new millennium. You recall the larger number of celebrations about the new millennium and how we're entering a new world and everything's going to be rather different. It struck me at the time that what was involved there was not simply looking forward, but forgetting. That is, forgetting what had happened in the previous century, the 20th century. Now, the 20th century, in many ways, was a terrible century. It's the century not only of 2 world wars, a spate of dictatorships in Italy, in Germany, and a quasi-dictatorship in Spain, and of course, the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union. But it was also the time of holocausts and gulags. It was the time of Korea and the Korean War. It was the time of Vietnam and the killing fields of Cambodia. So it's a century in which there is a lot of slaughter, a lot of destruction, and especially wreaked on civilian populations, not just soldiers dying in battle. The main thing about modern wars is that civilian casualties far, far outweigh military casualties. Now, in fighting these wars, the United States began to become a mobilized society because it had to defeat highly mobilized dictatorships, as in World War II. So the system, I think, began to change. For example, during World War II, there was universal conscription, there was wage and price controls, there was rationing of food and fuel, there was direction of the labor force, and of course a great surge of patriotism, of nationalism, all in the name of national unity, which of course led at one point to the relocation of the Japanese Americans. Then as soon as World War II was over in 1945, without scarcely missing a beat, the United States proclaimed a Cold War against the Soviet Union. Now, at the same time, that something was happening, though, that was different, that was proven in the Cold War and proven again in Korea and proven again in Vietnam. And that was that you could fight wars of a certain kind without really bothering the population. Neither the Korean War, nor the Vietnam War, nor the Gulf War, nor any of those wars really imposed sacrifices on the population, unlike the German example, where the population suffered severely, where they were often short of food, short of fuel, short of housing, and so on and so forth. Now, in this period where this new development was taking place, there was also, as we know, some changing views beginning in the Cold War era. Views about civil liberties, views about loyalty, views about patriotism, which found their way into loyalty tests and found their way into blacklists, and in general produced something in American society which, except for the brief so-called Red Scare following World War I, really had very little precedent. Now, while this was going on, that is again contributing to the atmosphere of fear, even though it was often in the background rather than direct, was something that political and social scientists began to discover. They began to discover something about what they called the American voter. And they learned that the American voter was really, at best, a very anemic citizen, that they were uninterested, that he or she was uninterested in politics, that they were ignorant of politics, that they were unmotivated to vote. And sure enough, in the period following World War II, the actual percentage of voters who took active part in elections began to slowly go down. Now, at the same time that this mass of uninterested, apolitical voters began to take shape, political and social scientists discovered something else. They discovered public opinion polls. Now, the juncture between those two things, that is, between an apathetic citizenry and the discovery or invention of polling, meant, of course, that polls were being directed at an apathetic citizenry. And, of course, the polls, what was quickly learned, could be constructed. And along with that is you could devise the questions you wanted, that you could get, in a certain sense, the answers you wanted. That you, in other words, were creating, through the polls, a method of manipulation. It's always important to remember that voting research and polling began as market research. It began at the University of Michigan, where the Survey Research Center basically got into business by business. That is, conducting marketing surveys, so that the voter and the consumer became, again, almost interchangeable items. The result was, I think, the beginning of the development of what you could call a pseudo-democracy. That is, a democracy whose opinion was solicited, whose opinion was, it looked as though as their opinions were really wanted by the politicians and the leadership. But it was a democracy that, of course, existed within the confines of the polls. And the polls were usually of such a nature as to, for one reason or another, to edge out discontents, except when they were so widespread that they couldn't be ignored, but to also be very indifferent to minority opinions and be very indifferent to emerging protest movements. Now, the Vietnam War is interesting because it seemed to bring these proceedings to a halt. Not only was there widespread opposition to the war, but there was also, as we know, a stinging defeat for American power. But the war also, at the same time, reinforced this lesson that I mentioned a few moments ago, that you could have a very big war, lots of casualties, without really seeming to disturb people in their ordinary pursuits. The war was distant, it was remote, it was only brought to you by television, but your life wasn't really disrupted unless you had the misfortune to have a member of your family in the draft. Now, this meant, this war, you could fight that war without really resorting very much to truly universal conscription. As we know, getting out of the draft was a major preoccupation of young people, young men, in this period. And we also know that the end result was a military composed to a significant degree, out of proportion to their place in the population, of minorities, of racial minorities and cultural minorities, and also that it was a class army in an important degree. That is, the number of college graduates, the number of college students, the number of representatives of the upper middle class, and so on, were negligible. This was a war fought by the poor, to a large degree, and the minorities. Now, what all of this meant, I think, is that warfare, as we know it, was beginning to dissociate democracy from its place in the system, that the system became geared in such a way that democracy was reduced to a relatively insignificant part. Now, this began to pick up pace as we move into our own century. There was an interesting comment which the New York Times carried when a New York Times reporter asking people about their opinion of the Bush foreign policy, Bush II. And she explained her support for that policy by saying, after all, I'm quoting from her, after all, we are an empire. Now, the fact that empire and superpower are becoming part of the common political vocabulary signifies, I think, that important changes are really taking place, or have been taking place. We can see how something is amiss if we simply try to combine the word superpower with democracy. Who ever heard of a superpower democracy? Who ever heard of an imperial democracy? The combination sounds, as they say in philosophy, oxymoronic. That is, they don't fit together. They're opposed, and they shouldn't be in the same tandem. As I've said before, those words indicate, I think, again, an important systemic change. And changes have been taking place. Let me outline some of those changes with an eye towards trying to suggest how they fit into a more or less of a inverted totalitarianism. First, the presidency. Wars, and even these kind of wars that I've been talking about, expand presidential power. We know that from as recently as Vietnam, where Congress did what it did with the war against Saddam Hussein. That is, they virtually gave the president a blank check. Now, it's well to recall the words of Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln said at one point that no man, I'm quoting from him, no man should have the power, should hold the power of taking the nation into war. No one man should hold the power of taking the nation into war. And that's virtually, of course, what we have done. Now, this has been accompanied, of course, by the weakening of the legislative branch, the branch which traditionally was supposed to be closest to the people. And what has happened here is that representative institutions have been short-circuited. They've been short-circuited by the new array of lobbyists, by the new array of pressure groups, by the infusion of vast amounts of money. The result is that representatives, senators, and members of the House are more beholden to those people than they are to their constituents. So that in that contest between president and legislature, it's sort of no contest. That the weakening of one is accompanied by the strengthening of the other. Now, equally important, if not more important, is something else that I think has been less publicized. and that is the transformation of the party system. We're supposed to have, according to the textbooks, a two-party system. And in a two-party system, the function of one party is to govern. The function of the other party is to serve as an opposition party. And serving as an opposition party means offering an alternative that's more or less clear, that stands in significant opposition to the other party. Now, what I'm about to say, I don't mean to discourage any of Republicans among you, but I do want to say that the Republican Party, really since the Reagan administration, has transformed American politics. They've transformed it systematically by organizing a strong and significant ideology, by systematically developing not only party organization, but also developing support groups of various kinds. There are numerous young Republican groups. There are numerous groups named after the Federalists or named after James Madison and so on. In other words, it's a new phenomenon in America because the Republicans, unlike the Democrats, not only can govern on the basis of a fairly coherent ideology that's systematic, but they also, unlike the Democrats, they are a good, in quotation marks, opposition party. When they are in opposition, they oppose. Now, whatever you might think of that opposition, it at least preserves the idea of an alternative. But on the other hand, what has also happened, as we know, the Democrats have gravitated towards the center. And the so-called left of the Democratic Party is, except at election time, inconsequential. Now that means that, in effect, the Democrats have conceded that the one major important development in the last 40 years or so, and that is the Republican Party has won over the country to a basically conservative ideology. Now, I'm not trying to say that critically, I'm trying to state it as a fact. It is a more conservative society, and we owe it almost entirely to the efforts of the Republican Party and like-minded conservative groups, religious groups of sort of a similar kind. Now, the result is, that is the result of the Republicans being a gung-ho party and the Democrats being feckless, is that you virtually have a one-party system, even when the Democrats are in office. I mean, Bill Clinton was a centrist, and the centrists said, we are going to be fiscally responsible and conservative on financial matters. There's little to separate the Democrats from the Republicans. As a result, there's no significant opposition party, which, as we pointed out before, is related to the character of a totalitarian system. Then there's that equally important phenomenon, the politicization of the court system. Republicans, as we know, have systematically prepared judicial nominations. They have summer seminars for judges, including Supreme Court justices, where the virtues of the free market and conservative ideology are taught and expounded. They carefully groom and prepare candidates not only for positions on courts, but also in the district attorney system. Now, that development is, of course, important because our system, theoretically, depends on checks and balances. But the notion, I think, of an independent court, ideologically independent, is clearly something of a mythology, but it's an important change. Now, I could continue this, but let me just reel off very quickly because I realize I'm beginning to run short of time and your patience. But media concentration is also another building block of this thing, and I don't have to belabor that point. We all know what it means, but it means once more the diminishing of alternatives, the suppression of alternatives without taking people to concentration camps or beating them up or even forcing them to do things they wouldn't want to do. The homogenization of opinion that follows from this, I think, begins to look more and more like what it means to live in a system where a dominant ideology is really dominant. It means, among other things, other developments which contribute to that. Not the least of them is the changes in universities. This is a very important development which probably hasn't received the attention it should have. But universities now are very, very deeply penetrated by corporations. In MIT, for example, corporate types sit on the faculty as regular faculty members without really being faculty appointments. There similarly are cooperative research undertakings between corporations and universities. Now what's important about that is it's one more tendency to undermine intellectual independence. This is seen most clearly on not only what's happening with the universities, but think about think tanks. Think about the fact that most of the think tanks in the country are bankrolled by corporations. The vast majority of them are conservative. The vast majority of them are Republican. And that means, again, that public discourse in this country is dominated very often by think tanks. Those of you who listen to NPR will hear the name Heritage Foundation or the Center for Strategic Studies. These are all conservative think tanks, yet it's their voice that gets represented because of this crucial role they play as the spokesman of a Republican ideology and as a method or a place where policy proposals are first generated, then passed on to the administration, so that they're integrated into the system, and the think tanks are no more independent than other branches of the party. Now, I haven't talked about the erosion of civil liberties, but again, I think that what's happening is sort of familiar with you, and I won't go over that ground. Perhaps we can talk about it in question period. I do want to stress that the inversion of totalitarianism, as I've called it, is perhaps nowhere more strikingly displayed than in the fact, on the one hand, totalitarian regimes mobilize populations, regiment them, generally control them in some kind of unanimous goose step. But what was interesting, you recall that in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th incident, the president told the country, and I'm quoting from him, "Fly, consume, spend, and unite." Now, if you're at a war, in a war, as the war on terrorism was supposed to be, what you want is sacrifice and pull together. Let's all pitch in. But the president didn't ask anything of us. He told us to consume. The only thing he asked of us, chillingly, was, of course, to inform if we saw suspicious-looking people. But again, what I'm trying to get at, to put it very simply, totalitarianism seeks to mobilize populations. Inverted totalitarianism seeks to demobilize them, seeks to keep them in a demobilized condition, which is exemplified not only by this example that I have given, but also by the kind of apathy which afflicts the public, and which there's no real effort on the part of political parties to generally attempt to affect. Now, this situation, let me close now by saying, it's not easy to say what is to be done, because it's a system that's in position now, not simply something, one incident or one development or one tendency that's occurring. It's a combination of elements. And I don't think it's an exaggeration to call it critical totalitarianism. But then what do we do? Well, I think we have to begin by recognizing something which is sobering, but which I have come to believe more and more firmly. And that is that I think we make a mistake if we think about our political system as a democratic system. And that's not because the people in power are hypocrites. That's not it at all. It's rather that I don't think it's possible for democracy to be a political system under present conditions. That is, to really overlay the whole thing: society, economy, government. Now, the reason for that is democracy, I don't think, can govern a huge, complex society such as ours. And I think the day is past when it can. Now, there's also one other thing that contributes to that. And that is, it's a remark, if I could quote a remark of Aristotle. Aristotle said that democracy is the form of government run by those who work. Now, that's an important insight because it means that you don't have time. You don't have time to participate all the time, and you don't have what the rich have, the ability to buy proxies, proxy representatives, proxy people in charge of pressure groups, all the rest of it, fundraising, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So democracy begins from a disadvantage. It begins from the fact that ordinary people work. And that means that their political possibilities are from the outset severely restricted. Now, what that means, I think, are two things. One, I think you have to think of democracy, I think, first of all, as basically an opposition movement. That getting into power really into power, is going to be a rare occurrence the higher up you go in the hierarchy, higher up from local to county to state to federal. The higher up you go, the less the possibility of genuine democracy. You may get representative government or touches of it, but you won't really get democracy because you're, in a certain sense, undercutting the whole point. The whole point being that if democracy is based on those who work should also be in power. Now, it follows from that, I think, that the democratic citizen has to be viewed as someone who does work, but who can find, nonetheless, opportunities to take part. And that means, I think, we get back, even though it may seem trite to say so, we get back to localism. The only thing in which we can really comprehend, both in our energies and even in our intellects, are things that lie closer to us, that we know something about, and that which are not of sufficiently large scale to overcome all the disabilities of democracy. That's not a cheery prospect, and I'm not cheerleading, because I think it's a relatively grim prospect we face. But I do think we can take heart, because there is democracy in the way I've defined it all over the country. It's isolated, it's weak, it tends to be occasional, it tends to be episodic, but I think that doesn't mean that it's either impossible, but what is impossible is to take over a system, because I don't think when push comes to shove that democracy wants to govern, and I don't think it ought to govern in the simple sense of the people running the system. I think instead we have to think in different terms. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer questions, or Bill can screen them, field them.
You don't need to field them, or?
I don't know, if it gets too rough. Yes, all right, let's start right here.
You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that totalitarianism is expansive. Could you expand on that?
There's a lot of good scholarship on the nature of the Nazi regime, and there's a widespread consensus among scholars that the Nazi regime really had no point, that beyond expansion, war, mobilization for war, there was really nothing they really wanted to get, that the dynamism of war was their way of trying to push outward the energies that they were mobilizing internally. Mobilizing them internally meant regimenting, controlling, and that's what they wanted. But then the question became, what do you do with it once you mobilize? And the answer was war. Now, in the case of the Nazis, this mobilization was one that proved ultimately destructive. Now, because for all the obvious reasons, they not only lost the war, the society was devastated, but the the point one's trying to get at here is to raise the question, and perhaps I didn't spell this out enough, is to raise the question, what's the dynamism that drives inverted totalitarianism? In the Nazis, it was called Lebensraum. That is, we need living space. Now, when we think about it, the answer I come up with is that the dynamism, that is what really drives that system, is a combination that's, first of all, never reached the point it has reached now in American political history. The interpenetration of corporations into the state machinery. That's a crucial, crucial development. But the second thing, and corporations, as we know, capitalism is expansive. It moves around. It wants markets here, there, globalization. We all know how that goes. At the same time, what is also there is the nature of contemporary capitalism, which depends so importantly on technology and the application of science to technology, to production. Now, as we know, the nature of modern science, like modern technology, is to be continuously changing, to have a dynamic that forces it to do away with things it once believed in the past, with inventions it once believed in the past, and bring in something new. Computers are, of course, a beautiful example of it. But that kind of dynamism, which with the integration of science and technology into corporations, so that corporations now do more basic research than universities, gives to the American system, I think, the kind of push that the Germans got from other things. Somebody over there. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm a revisionist historian.
That's okay. I'm from Northern California.
And what that means, and my name's Professor Ping Pong, by the way. What that means is that I don't buy the accepted history of what happened with the Nazis, with the war in Europe, that I see a different truth that happened there.
And what's your question?
And the connection of that truth with what's going on right here in America is very profound.
Sure, go ahead.
That means that the same forces that brought Hitler to power, that ravaged Europe, are the same forces that are bringing America to this totalitarian state, that are ravaging America and the rest of the world for their own gains. And I'm incredulous that you have something to say like these forces are, these forces are going to rule the world and there's nothing that we can do about them. And it's preferable to democracy. It's preferable to what our input is going to be for a world view, or are we going to go with the input of the totalitarians? Obviously, they have the power. They have been imposing their will on the people of the planet for thousands of years already. And I think our first and most important task is to understand that, to understand what really happened historically and what's happening right now. Without that understanding, we have no hope of trying to rectify the situation, that we can see the direction it's going.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that point in asking, I think it's fairly well known that President Bush, his two grandfathers, were actively involved in the munitions industry in Nazi Germany, and even then realized that the national state was something to manipulate. Mm-hmm. And I would ask you to comment on whether the national state now is being manipulated like any other organization for profit and gain.
The short answer is yes. Yes, the point I was trying to make is that you're getting this integration of corporation and state now, which is, although the favoritism to corporations is an old story in American history, we know that. But what again one is talking about is the systematic relationship between the two. It's seen in little things. I mean, it's seen in things where you get corporate executives as the head of the departments of defense. At the same time, you get retired generals who go into corporations. and now into the media. But I don't disagree with that. I think that that's certainly the case. I think one has to say that there are important differences of degree that set off this inverted system from classic totalitarianism. For example, under the Nazis, capitalists were not in the driver's seat. They were a significant element in the regime, and they supported the regime, but they did not call the tunes. Now, you just have to look at the occupation in Iraq now to know that it's a different story going on right now. So that the relationship between corporation, between big business, between capitalism, whatever you want to call it, and the system has now taken a sort of quantum jump because they're becoming indistinguishable. And I think that's the crucial point. They're becoming indistinguishable, something that simply was not the case with Nazism, as I've said. So, yes, sir.
At the end of your speech, you said, I think, if I remember correctly, you said that democracy didn't want to rule and was incapable of ruling. Those are pretty radical statements, not what I expected to hear. So thank you. But given that, given the possibility that you're telling the truth and that you're right, what do you think we can hope for?
Well, but I think it's important, I mean, you're right in what I said, but I think it's very important to remember that what I really meant to take seriously, the notion of ruling, of governing, and that's what I said democracy can't do. Let's just begin with a basic point. To govern a contemporary society, you have to have a bureaucracy, an administration. Administrations are hierarchical, they're anti-egalitarian, there's nothing democratic about government bureaucracies. Now, to say democracy is going to rule and use bureaucracy as every government must in the contemporary stage is to me to sort of try to combine water and oil. It's just not going to work. That doesn't mean you don't vote for better candidates for office. That doesn't mean that at all. It just means what are your expectations from supporting, let's say, Dianne Feinstein over against some Republican. And you say, well, maybe in the end it's Dianne. But however that may be, it's not going to mean democracy is going to live or die by that decision. It does mean, however, if you've got a school board, if you've got schools, if you've got local hospitals, if you've got 100 other things that are possibly within your control and that your participation in it can make a difference, it seems to me that's where you go. Because remember, the Dianne Feinsteins of this world, I don't mean that really invidiously, but they're going to demand less and less of you. They're going to say, pay your taxes and vote. And you don't even have to vote, pay your taxes. But that's all they're really asking, because they'll keep you in law and order. You don't have to do that. They'll take care of seeing that you toe the mark. But it's not a democratic demand that they're laying on you. It's just not. So, yes, miss. How do I see it? Well, not being on it, I don't think I'm qualified to talk. I do think, I guess I do think that the original enthusiasm that saw the internet as a great democratic invention or contribution, I think is partially right. There's a lot you can certainly learn, and even I have learned some things from the internet. But I think that we're always faced with that problem, which is the more your communication system gets internet, the easier it is to control it. And we also know that that's what's going on right now is a continuous fight, like the Patriot Act, which again gave the authorities the right to inspect library acquisitions, to look at what books particular individuals read, what books they bought at the bookstore.
My question to you is, it seems to me that the Europeans are more engaged politically, are more aware, and less apathetic. If you agree with me, why is that?
It's not easy to give an answer, except to say that I think the European political cultures have been much more vibrant and alive if for no other reason. I would point out that you have two things going, and I'm sure there are many, many more, but you do have parties with a difference. That's one thing. That is and that contributes to interest in politics because it isn't all monochrome or monotone. The second thing is you have, I think, particularly I'm thinking of countries like France and Germany and Britain and Italy to a lesser degree, but you have countries in which there really are and really are cherished independent intellectual positions. There's a much more, I don't mean to be tooting a horn simply because I was a university person, but an independent intellectual establishment, if I can use that word, is really very crucial, as long as they're independent, because it introduces a critical medium and something for people to think about and rally around or take and carry further. And I guess I would signal out those things as a basic. Well, wait, you've been taught. Well, let's get this gentleman back there, please.
I was wondering, you said there's some inherent flaws in democracy. Mm-hmm. Is there some other system that could be in some way representative of a broad range of individuals that might work in the obviously complex culture that we have come to live in?
Sure there are. I mean, there are all kinds of proportional representation systems and other systems in which you can choose not simply one candidate, but several candidates. And if your candidate doesn't win, your vote gets moved down the column. They all exist. But I think, while that, there are just so many problems with trying to introduce a new development into a system which is so systematized now and so dominated by money and big money, really big money, and also by the collaboration between money and the media, that it's really very difficult to conceive of an electoral gimmick that will really change things. Because again, the danger you can run, and this is something that the Weimar Republic that preceded Hitler ran into, and that is that they had systems of proportional representation, but the result was you splintered parties. You had a multi-party system with no party ever getting a majority. And this made for relatively weak governments at a time, this is during the Depression, the Great Depression, in which strong, effective state action was needed. So that the reaction, one of the reasons the Nazis began to get greater and greater numbers of votes at the polls was that the people were becoming more and more disenchanted with a democratic system that seemed to connote weakness and bring weakness and division, rather than developing a coherent party with a majority system in which a party could really govern. Yes. Yes.
This question is kind of two-parted. Is this imperialism that's developing, is it kind of a natural progression of politics, and is it sustainable? I mean, it seems like it's going to go down eventually. It can't, the way it's going, it just can't keep going. And what do you sort of foresee once it crashes?
I think one thing one has to begin from, this would take a long time to develop, but I think the present administration's notion of an empire is different from the British Empire or the Roman Empire. I think it's a conception in which they did not think of having colonies or settling into an area and claiming it and running it in some kind of direct administrative way, as in colonialism. I think that what they thought was that you could, in effect, make a society, another society, susceptible, amenable, malleable to our influence, and that we would not have to make a great commitment of a kind where we had standing armies and standing bureaucracies over there. Now, I think I may be wrong about this, and it's probably too early to say, but I think the Iraq thing has simply not turned out the way they thought it would. And that they thought it was going to be, as the President and Rumsfeld said on more than one occasion, it's in and out. And clearly in and out isn't going to work, because you've raised a mare's nest in Iraq, and it's no foreseeable future. Are you going to get out without weakening your position? Now, where it's going to go, I honestly don't know. I think that it depends a lot on what the economy does here at home. It depends a lot on whether the Democratic Party is capable of pulling itself into some kind of coherent opposition, which is chancy and doubtful. So that it's simply hard to say. I mean, certainly if the economy recovers, Bush will get an extraordinary mandate, as he's already got one. And that's going to create a greater impetus for what's going on. Now, again, one could talk about, without, I think, getting terribly far, except to mention it, that there apparently are some kinds of elements in the Bush administration that are thinking about remaking the world, especially beginning with the Middle East. And that would be the form it would take if they're capable of running it, which I think very much remains to be seen. Yes, Miss?
I guess I'm coming from a place of naivete. Do you think that there's any way of redeeming the Democratic Party, of reminding them what they once stood for? Or does one simply vote for the Green Party because it's something new? I mean, I'd like to do something that will make a difference.
You see, again, we get back to the point. For the Democratic Party to compete against the Republican Party, it's got to compete in all the ways that the Republican Party has been successful, in fundraising, in media campaigns, and on. So that even if the Democratic Party has a certain will to move back to the left a bit, it's going to be very difficult, because the conditions under which parties compete now are not conducive to that kind of thing. Plus the other fact which I pointed out, which I think the success of the Republicans in creating a generally conservative electorate. But I think you could certainly do far better than the Democrats have done. There are pockets of Democratic strongholds in this country, not only California, but also Massachusetts, Vermont, and some of the other eastern states, and some of the western states, not the mountain states, but some of the western states. So that it's possible, and I mean, we should always remember, I mean, don't get too disheartened, we should always remember that the Democrats won the last election. And that, and that's no small point, because I mean, it indicates, that it's a terribly evenly divided electorate. But to make my point again, at a certain level, it doesn't mean much, because the more they're alike, it doesn't make much difference if they're even or not. It only makes a difference if there's a dissimilarity that's substantive. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate your coming here. I have a question for you. Does this audience resemble your other audiences?
I'm not great for audiences these days. Yeah, it does. I mean, the ones I've talked to. And I do think that Northern California and the part we all live in is different from a lot of other places. I mean, there is more activism here, more participation than virtually any place except parts of Vermont and Massachusetts. That it simply is the case. So that in one sense, you're all unrepresentative of the country as a whole, but one shouldn't overstate that. One shouldn't overstate that, because things do happen in other parts of the country from which one can take heart. But I think it's very hard, particularly in a period in which the economy's in recession, to get people to think about putting their shoulder to the wheel and trying to move the country in a different direction politically, when they're worried clearly and rightly about other things. And I think that's true probably here as well as it is anywhere.
I'm just wondering how concerned you think we need to be about the fact that corporations now own the voting machines, and they're becoming more and more computerized.
Yeah.
And it seems to me there have already been examples where it's been highly questionable that the so-called winner, and when the voters asked to see the actual tally on the software, they were told by judges this was a private corporation's prerogative. So if I'm going to cast my vote that's owned by a corporation, this seems a bit strange.
The alternative isn't very good, though, if you don't cast your vote.
Oh, I absolutely believe they must vote.
Yeah. No, it's hard. It's very hard. I guess I can't overemphasize that I'm really not talking about the Republican Party as such or the corporation as such. I mean, I don't hate Republicans. What I'm really talking about is a systematic organization of politics in a way that it has never been organized before. And the Republicans are just very good at it, partly because I suppose they come from more business backgrounds and management backgrounds than Democrats do. But again, one gets driven back to the point that this system would be perfectly delighted if you sort of shrugged your shoulders and said, screw voting, that it's all a shuck anyway. And I think, once you get to that point, it's no longer a contest. You are to some degree. You are to some degree, because it's very difficult to figure out how you're going to crack it. There have been people who've tried to mount third parties in the last 10, 15 years, and not only Nader, but other people as well, and they haven't gone very far because they simply can't compete on the terms that the political game is being played now. They don't have the money, they don't have the media access, they don't have the core of pundits and think tank people to chant for them. It's very, very difficult to, and the history of third parties is just indicates how difficult it will really be to challenge the system on its own ground. Yes, ma'am.
It's kind of hard to listen to you say that these things are difficult. I mean, I think we all know that they're difficult, and yet some of the solutions seem, for example, getting money out of politics, maybe instituting proportional representation so that there is some diversity of views in New York Congress. And then, of course, not allowing the media to monopolize, to have a handful of media corporations monopolize the airwaves. I mean, there are some things that are clearly obvious things that we need to do in order to have a representative government. If not, obviously, we don't have a direct democracy, but I don't, it's not an intellectual exercise to just say, well, it's too hard, we can't do it, because the existence of the planet is at stake. I think a lot of us feel that way, whether you think it's the possibility of a nuclear war or just the piecemeal dismantling of our environment. So it may be difficult, but I think we want, we're here, we want to do something. And I guess if you're saying, well, don't bother trying to work through the political system, I guess the question is, well,
you can construe that any way you choose. I think it's always the better part of valor to realize what you're up against. And that there's because one of the troubles, of course, with reform politics is that it soon loses momentum. People become discouraged because it's easy to defeat them. But I'm hoping that if we can realize how really serious the present situation is, which is why I used scare words like totalitarianism, is that if we do realize that, then we're perhaps prepared to make more of a commitment than we're making, and we have to go to try to devise ways of coordinating, cooperating, extending our alliances, and creating bigger movements. I think that's the only thing that's going to save us. But you see, when you talk about, for example, campaign finance reform, the only way you can really do that, the way the thing's set up now, is through the system. And we've seen what the McCain-Feingold thing amounted to, which was a really terrific effort to get very little. The thing is really cuts very deeply. I mean, I think we need to think differently. Let me just mention one other thing. One of the most remarkable achievements of the Republicans is to teach the country that the government of a so-called democracy should be gotten off your back. I mean, it's as though there's something inherently incompatible between democracy and using the government for your purposes. But they have managed to really create a suspicion of government, a distrust of government, and sooner or later, of course, it reaches the point where you darn well better distrust them for all the obvious reasons. But it's taken away a tremendous thing that we had in this country as late as the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. That is the notion that government could be used to make people's lives better, ordinary people, and people who are struggling, people of different colors. And that was a great victory from the New Deal through the Fair Deal to the Great Society. But that's been punctured. Now it's give back the taxes, and then it's all sort of summed up in that wonderful strategy that the Republicans have devised, which is you give away a huge government surplus in order that, should you not retain power, the incoming government will have nothing to do, no money to spend on social programs. I mean, that's what actually has happened. And the whole thing is involved, as I've been trying to say, a complete reversal of how we had understood government. We had understood it as an extension of the people. It's our government. And now, as I say, get it off our backs. It's a stranger.
Think about the electorate, and it's common knowledge that no more than 50% of the people in this country vote, and the beneficiaries of whatever social structures, safety nets, aid are out there to enable people to have a better life. Those people don't vote. Why don't they vote? Why don't they get off their ass and do something in their own interest? Why are the poor in this country so disenfranchised that they don't do something in their own effort? Why are we doing it for them? Why have the liberal, progressive people in this country, why has that responsibility fallen on their shoulders when the people for whom their efforts are directed don't make an effort of their own? Are they so incapacitated that they can't rise and speak for themselves? And if they don't, we as a whole have no chance of promoting their interests, is really what things have come down to. So what will promote the poor of this country to rise in their own interests? Will that ever happen? Or are they so disenfranchised and so hopeless that voting is not part of their vocabulary?
I can answer that question if you will allow me to. Because I am poor, I am disabled, and I am a minority. And what you may not realize is the systematic Republican and Democratic turning away from state-level complete disenfranchisement of minorities. African-American men, once they are convicted of any criminal action, and believe me, they are criminalized at 10 times the number of any other race, are not allowed to vote.
Felony.
Are not allowed to vote.
It's a felony.
Many of their convictions are felonies because they are convicted at a felony rate much higher than any other race. Language barriers in the, excuse me, I didn't interrupt you. Please don't interrupt me. Language barriers in non-English speaking but legitimate citizen areas create a very difficult ability for people to whom language of English is not their first language. Whether or not you have feelings about that, it is a voting barrier. There were incidences not only in Florida in the 2000 election, but across the country of people being prevented from voting, of their votes not being tallied correctly, and in the case of San Francisco, in the interim election, boxes full of ballots found floating in the San Francisco Bay. Do not assume that minority people have no interest. They struggle mightily to be able to actually get registered to vote, appear at a voting station and be giving a ballot and actually having their vote counted. Thank you.
This actually isn't a question. This is a tag on to an answer to his question.
I think she gave it.
Well, there's one other little less interesting and heartfelt, but by the time election day comes, there's nothing in it for most people. The process leading up to who gets slated leaves out 99% of Americans. I grew up in the city of Chicago, and by the time it's determined who's on the ballot, the deal's over anyway. And election day is meaningless to most people.
And that's on purpose here.
Oh yeah, it's part of the system. There's the money primary, where you have to raise money before you can even be seriously backed by enough people to win a party nomination, to be allowed to run against somebody else. It's not an open political system.
Isn't that where they vote early and vote often?
You betcha. So I mean, people are weeded out and isolated. Even in local politics, by the time you're figuring out who to back for supervisor, there have been people talking about it for months before anybody's writing about it in the newspaper.
Well, since we're doing freeform, I just want to add this comment. In Barbara Ehrenreith's book, Nickel and Dime, you read that book and you'll see why the poor, a lot of them aren't voting. They're struggling to survive. These are people sometimes living out of their van with these minimum wage jobs and trying to get their kids and off to school. I mean, you can't imagine these people being concerned. They don't have time to read a paper or anything, even if it's to be misinformed by the paper.
You said tonight twice, we really need to be thinking differently. Can you jumpstart us along?
Well, I tried to in a couple of ways. I'm trying to jumpstart you to think differently about where we are, and that's really and where we're going. I also try to think that that at the end of the talk, excuse me, at the end of the talk, I've tried to suggest that we start from where we are, and where we are is we're local, and that we've got to not only cultivate that, but we've also got to start thinking about some way to develop larger alliances and larger movements without thinking, I believe, that we need to start at this point a political party, because the terms on which we would have to compete are simply beyond us. That you can't compete with deep pockets and with organizations that work 365 days a year. So that I mean, it's all around us. There are things we can do, and it's beginning, to hit home where we should be able to feel it and should be able to realize what's happening. I mean, what's happening to schools under the present budget constraints, what's happening to infrastructures, what's happening to hospitals and medical care. I mean, and those are the issues that really affect us and that affect our children and affect the communities in which we live. But we've got to start with those things, because those are the things in which we can begin with some kind of input, because the school boards are responsive up to a point, and so are boards of supervisors, and all the rest of it. I mean, there are pressure points we can identify and work at, but it calls for people willing to make more of a commitment, evidently, than we've been able to generate. So that, and I think, I think also you come down to this. I think at bottom, if there's anything important about democratic, small d, it's that ordinary people like all of us really should not be given or shouldn't look for recipes, that it's up to us to devise responses, solutions to what we feel is pressing and urgent in the world around us, that we shouldn't look, that that's what a democratic solution is. It's people with ordinary abilities and very ordinary free time at their disposal who can do that, who are willing to think about what could be done to improve the school thing, to improve libraries, to improve this, that, and the other thing. And I think that's part of what makes democracy more than a political system. It's an experience. It's an experience in which you grow with the challenges you're trying to meet, and you don't simply file to the voting booth on election day. Yes, sir.
If the plan that the present regime has is to militarily dominate the world, and apparently that's their plan, on the ground and in the air, and that's going to take a lot of money. If the government is giving all of these huge amounts of money away, how can this government finance its military hegemony over the planet if it's going to give these vast sums of money away to the corporate elite or to the elite in this country?
One way, of course, is that the government proceeds to make the military appropriations a larger and larger part of the budget. And if you've got majorities or near majorities in both houses, you can sort of do that. The other way you do it, and which you can see taking place in Iraq right now, is you try to get the country that you've dominated to pay for it. And that's, of course, a wonderful concept. We bomb them, and then they pay for their reconstruction. It's catch-22. So that, I mean, they'll do it. They'll starve the domestic economy to the point where they think it can no longer tolerate it. But I wouldn't underestimate their ingenuity. But I guess you also have to face, I guess they would also face the fact, I'm just sort of freewheeling at this point, I think they're sufficiently cynical that if push comes to shove and they have to scale back the military, they will. I think they will. That is to say, if the economy really stays in free fall and you can no longer deal with the numbers of unemployed and the rising unemployment benefits problem and the rising healthcare problems of unemployed people, then I think that political prudence would dictate that they have to go easy. And I think they would. I think we shouldn't underestimate them. They're really very good at what they do. And they're also perfectly willing to change course when they have to. And so that I don't think one should look at them as an express train heading down a track in which suddenly the rails don't exist anymore. I think they're much cleverer than that, and for that reason more dangerous. So, should we have one more?
Yeah, something was sticking in my mind. I wish you'd say something about the Leo Strauss philosophy and the sycophants involved in it that are in the administration, just as a way of, to my mind, showing how very silly and short-sighted they are.
Does anybody know, do people understand this controversy? There's a story in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about how the hell-bent for domination boys in the Defense Department come out of the University of Chicago. So the question became, where did they learn all this stuff about reordering the world and dominating the world and letting the elite govern? And there's a professor of political philosophy at Chicago named Leo Strauss. And the whole thing is sort of a wondrous kind of fairy tale because Strauss wrote the most obscure books you can imagine. I don't recommend them to anybody except somebody with the patience of Job. But the point being that Strauss taught a version of elitism, which in effect suggested to those who understood him and whom he took into his circle that they were specially destined to understand politics and to rule a country. At the same time, it was a political philosophy that was very, very cool towards democracy of any kind. So that the triumph of the Wolfowitzes and the 3 or 4 other people that they mention in the department is seen as a sort of vindication of Strauss, who died quite a number of years ago. But I think it's sort of a blip on the screen that I don't think really matters that much. I think what matters much, much more is the way that certain things have come together in this administration, beginning with, as I've said, corporate power, intellectual power, an ideology, party organization, and a lot of other things I talked about. That, I think, is where you start from where the real problem lies. I could refute Leo Strauss tomorrow and it wouldn't make a bit of difference. Thank you.
Yes.